We're starting the season that the Christian church has for a long time called Advent. Now, Advent literally means to come to. And that's a pretty good name for this time of year in this season that's leading up to Christmas. Advent is a time when Christians are waiting and preparing for the coming of Jesus at Christmas. I guess you could say that in some ways the world is doing that too. Not getting ready for Jesus, but waiting for and preparing for Christmas. I mean, just look around you at all the Christmas decorations that are already up everywhere. But Advent is actually a lot more than pre-Christmas. Oh, in a few weeks, we'll get to the stories like Zechariah and Mary that lead directly into the story of Jesus' birth. But traditionally, the first weeks of Advent focus on the second coming of Jesus. The time when Jesus, who came to earth as a baby and grew up and lived on earth for 30-some years and died on the cross to forgive our sins and rose from the dead and then ascended into heaven, will now come back again to judge the world. Now, I'm not going to get all end-timesy on you here and look at a bunch of Bible stuff and try to correlate world events with those little details in the Bible to figure out when that day will be. That's interesting speculation, but that's all it is, speculation. I mean, Jesus himself clearly says, no one knows the day or the hour of his return. So while in these days when the general direction of the world seems like to be headed away from God and his ways and not toward him, and in that kind of a world you might be longing for those days to come and trying to figure out the exact time that, judgment is going to come and evil's going to get it. Well, actually trying to find out the exact day or time of that is, kind of pointless. But figure out what I need to do to prepare for the day when Jesus comes for me, to take me home to heaven, and how I should live as I'm waiting for that. Well, that's kind of important. That's kind of important. And that's the part of Advent that we're going to look at in the next 2 weeks. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells us some stories to get us kind of headed in that direction. Here's the first one. Matthew chapter 25, starting at verse 1.
When the end comes, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids. They took their oil lamps and went to meet the groom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The 5 foolish bridesmaids took their lamps, but they didn't take any extra oil. The wise bridesmaids, however, took along extra oil for their lamps. Since the groom was late, all the bridesmaids became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, someone shouted, "The groom is here, come to meet him." Then all the bridesmaids woke up and got their lamps ready. The foolish ones said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." But the wise bridesmaids replied, "We can't do that. There won't be enough for both of us. Go, find someone to sell you some oil." While they were buying oil, the groom arrived. The bridesmaids who were ready went with him into the wedding hall, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids arrived and said, Sir, open the door for us." But he answered them, "I don't even know who you are. So stay awake, because you don't know the day or the hour."
So what's the big truth that Jesus is wanting us to get out of this story? Well, here's some background to help us hear the same thing that Jesus' first audience would have been hearing. Now, according to Jewish wedding customs, the engagement was a legally binding contract, one that could be broken only by divorce. And so the bride and the groom, they were legally married, but they weren't yet allowed to live together. And there was a legally prescribed waiting period, 9 to 12 months, before the wedding could be finalized. Now, some of the things that the bride and the groom would be doing in that waiting period was that both the bride and the groom would be preparing for that final wedding day. including sending out all the invitations, which in this culture would probably have been going out to everybody in the small little community. So one of the points Jesus is making here is that everyone is invited. Right? Everyone is invited. No one is excluded unless for some reason they chose not to come to the wedding or they weren't prepared on the day when the wedding day comes. Jesus wants us to see that God is for all and invites all. Well, anyway, back to these wedding things. You know that the wedding's going to take place sometime in those months 9 to 12, but you don't know exactly when. And you don't know the time of day that it's going to be either. But sometime in those months 9 to 12, the announcement is going to come. Hey, everything is ready. Everything's ready for the wedding. Now's the time. Come to the party. Right? And then the groom, accompanied in a big procession by his friends and the bride's friends, would go to the bride's house, and then there'd be a big procession as they take her from her house to his house, and then the consummation of the wedding and the big celebration now that everything was complete. And if the groom happened to come at night, like in this story, it would in some ways add to the festivity of the day. You see, this is a world without electricity. So it is dark, dark, dark out there in the middle of the night and quiet. So think about it. It's pitch black in the middle of the night, it's quiet, and it is suddenly interrupted by twinkling lights and lamps and torches and singing. Must have seemed like New Year's Eve if that's when the wedding started. But this is also a world without 24-hour convenience stores, okay? So if you wanted to be a part of the procession, you absolutely, positively had to have enough oil on hand so that if they happened to come in the middle of the night, you would be prepared. Because at the last minute, those stores, they might not be open. And then there's this. Sometimes the bridegroom gave some advance notice, but a lot of times he didn't. Sometimes the bridegroom didn't give advance notice other than, hey, it's going to happen sometime in the 9 to 12 months. And sometimes he did that to heighten the anticipation or the celebration, and also maybe to test the dedication of both the bride and the guests. So that's why he would sometimes come suddenly, like he does in this story, in the middle of the night, and suddenly, surprise, it's time. Oh, okay, that's some of the background of the story. Are you starting to maybe get some of the point that Jesus is driving at? Especially when you consider that he's talking about what we'll call end times living, and what we're supposed to do with our faith in those days when Jesus could return at any time. Well, let's peel back one more layer. At the start of that month 9, the anticipation is going to be pretty high. Hey, the bridegroom could return at any time. And the preparations for the big event were probably pretty good. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, some of the people invited to the wedding probably got a little tired of waiting, got a little tired of continuing to make those daily preparations, and so they probably stopped being quite so diligent about making sure things were ready for whenever the bridegroom would make his announcement. I mean, it was a lot of work to do, to keep enough oil on hand for those lamps, and they had a lot of other important things to do too. And so, well, life kind of got in the way. And so for some of those invited guests, the important, being ready for whenever the bridegroom would make his announcement, that's the important. Well, the important became much less urgent. And though they weren't, and so they ended up not being as prepared as they thought they were. I mean, they did have oil for their lamps, just not enough on hand for the middle of the night celebration. And perhaps that little detail might be getting at something else that Jesus is hinting at here, that the urgent and the important, which is taking care of and nurturing and strengthening and growing your faith, that urgent and important can quite easily move down in priority. And while you still see it as important, it becomes much less urgent. And other things start getting in the way of your attention and time and effort and resources that you're pouring into that because, well, oil's expensive, right? Why buy it now if you can wait till later? And it takes time to go to the store every day. And why do that if you can wait till later? Now think about how that applies to faith. Right, before we move on in this conversation, take a moment to think about how that particular detail applies to your current situation. What life do you find getting in the way of taking care of your faith right now? Again, think about that. What life do you find getting in the way of taking care of your faith right now? Hit pause and spend a few minutes thinking about that, or talking about that if you're watching or listening with someone before moving on in this conversation. Just a little more background to help us zero in on the main point that Jesus is making here. Now, people who've studied that time and culture suggest that the word lamp there is actually something more like torches. Big long sticks with rags wrapped around them that needed to be soaked in oil to be effective and need to be constantly replenished with oil so that the oil doesn't dry out. Because if the oil dried out, well, the lamp might start, but the fire wouldn't last for very long. And does that perhaps play into the point, again, that Jesus is trying to make here? See, if the bridegroom came in the middle of the night like this, again, it wasn't just to heighten the anticipation of the celebration. It also might be to test the dedication and the faithfulness of the guests. In other words, was the relationship that they had with the bridegroom so important that they do what was necessary to be ready whenever he showed up? I mean, that's Jesus' big point here. Be prepared. Be prepared. Last sentence in the story, verse 13. So stay awake because you don't know the day or the hour. In other words, be prepared because you never know when Jesus is coming back. You don't know when the end of the world is, when that second coming is, and you don't know when your end in this world is. I mean, people with a terminal illness might know that they're dying soon, but what about all the accidents and all the sudden deaths and all the unexpected tragedies that claim lives? How much warning did they have? Basically, not much. Maybe even none. So I think the point here is, the big point Jesus is making is before Jesus comes, it is never too late. Never too late. I mean, his gracious invitation is always out there. Remember, the invitation went to the whole community. But Jesus' continuing point is, when he comes again, it's too late to reestablish a relationship that's grown cold. And it's too late to rekindle a fire if the spark's gone out. And it's too late to refuel again if your tank has already run empty. I mean, here's how the end of the story puts it. Let me read it to you again. While they were buying oil, the groom arrived. The bridesmaids who were ready went with him into the wedding hall, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids arrived and said, Sir, open the door for us. But he answered them, I don't even know who you are. The point? Again, be ready. Be prepared. Because Jesus could come at any time. Again, verse 13, stay awake because you don't know the day or the hour. Now, we get the point. But that still leaves us with a few questions to talk about. Question number one, if the main point is be ready, be prepared, well, what makes us ready or prepared? Well, it's more than just having your name on a church list somewhere, because both the foolish ones and the wise ones had the same invitation, but as the celebration began, the foolish ones found themselves on the outside. And it's also more than just being busy doing some things to get ready for the bridegroom coming, because while this doesn't really address it here in the story, I think that both sets of women were at least doing something to get ready for their wedding because they knew that it was coming in that time period. Now, it's also even more than just knowing things about the bridegroom or knowing who the bridegroom is. There's a very similar conversation about that in Matthew chapter 7. Let me read it to you. Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Okay, if that's what being prepared isn't, well, what does it mean to be prepared? What is being prepared or being ready for Jesus' return? Very simply, it's having faith. It's having faith. Faith not in what you can do for God, but in what God in Jesus has already done for you. Faith that Jesus died and rose to forgive your sins so that your relationship with God could be put right. Faith not in your works or efforts or knowledge, but faith in God's grace. Faith that's more about receiving that grace of God in your life and relying about what Jesus has already done for you than scrambling at the last moment to do something that you aren't able to do. You aren't able to prove that on your own you're worthy to come to the party. Think about that in the context of this story again, about what it means to be prepared. The invitation was already given and received, so there's nothing more to do to enjoy the wedding and the celebration than to be ready when the bridegroom comes. And again, being ready is about receiving what Jesus has already done. Some 2,000 years ago, Jesus already lived the perfect life that we never could, so that perfect life could be counted as ours. Some 2,000 years ago, Jesus put himself in our place and shed his blood on the cross in order that our sins could be forgiven. Some 2,000 years ago, on an early Sunday morning, Jesus turned death into life. And in turning death into life, he destroyed the stranglehold that sin, death, and the power the devil had on us. Jesus has already prepared everything that we need for life with him. So all that's necessary is that we open our hands and receive what he gives us, and that we're prepared with open hands and willing hearts to come when he calls, whenever and wherever that is. Okay, question number 2. Well, how does being prepared like that then affect your attitude? Well, if you're prepared, there's a joy and an anticipation for the party. You already know you have the invitation and you're prepared, so you know that you're going to be at the wedding banquet. And you know that weddings are fun, right? Have you ever been to a sad wedding? Didn't think so. All right, so you look forward to the party. and you anticipate the coming celebration, and you approach what can sometimes seem like boring and tedious tasks, like keeping the oil on hand. Well, you approach those tasks with more energy and more effort and more enthusiasm and more importance, because you know that what you're doing is preparing for that party. And you even start to find that even the simple fact of doing those things can start bringing you some joy, because you're doing them for the relationship. You're doing them for the relationship, and because the relationship's important to you, and you don't want to miss out on any part of that. And that fills you with joy in even doing those simple, regular tasks. And then question number 3, well, if we're prepared and you've got this attitude of joy and anticipation, well, question 3 is, what do you do to make the best use of the waiting period? What do you do? Now, you're not doing something all the time. Did you notice that in the story everyone slept? Both the wise and the foolish? But here's the difference between the two. The wise ones slept, but they also apparently kept watch. Right? And the wise ones make sure, as they're keeping watch, that they also had enough oil for their lamps, so they were ready whenever the bridegroom showed up, even if it happened to be in the middle of the night when they didn't really expect it. So the wise ones, they just didn't sit around and coast, concentrating on other things, figuring that the oil that they started with would last. What they did was they tended to those torches every day and made sure every day that they had the oil that they needed if the bridegroom were to appear suddenly and come at night. And that's the difference between the ones that Jesus called wise and the ones that he called foolish. The foolish ones didn't do anything to keep tending their torches. They're thinking that maybe the oil that they already had would last. Did it? Were they really ready for the bridegroom to come at any time? So let's make some connections. If the torches here stand for our faith, then Jesus' point about his coming seems to be, well, as you're waiting, take care of your faith. Take care of your faith. Don't take it easy. Don't coast. Don't assume. Put in some effort. Put some effort into your faith. Tend to your faith. Nurture and grow your faith. Invest in your relationship with Jesus. And if we go even further, if the oil doesn't stand just for faith, but also for having a close relationship with God, then questions to think about are things like these. Well, what are you doing with your oil, with your faith? What are you doing to make closeness with God a daily pursuit? What are you doing to know God better and to love God more? What are you doing to develop your faith and to grow in your faith on a daily basis? What are you doing to work out your faith in daily life? How much time do you spend talking to God? How much time do you spend listening to Him? I mean, how are you spending the days that you have here on earth? Like the 5 who thought, well, what I got's enough to see me through? Or like the 5 who kept going out to refill their oil? In other words, who kept seeking to grow their faith and grow deeper in their relationship with Jesus. I mean, Jesus' message is clear. Don't just say you're prepared, be prepared. And make sure that the important, faith-wise, continues to also be urgent. Okay. The question for today is, what are you doing to make sure that you are?